The Thrustmaster Warthog HOTAS is the best joystick on the market, period. However, it suffers badly from sticking at points in its travel. The problem is caused by small ridges left on the moulded plastic components during manufacture. It's almost impossible to fly a helicopter or any aircraft with very fine movements with these ridges creating sticking points. My first attempt to solve this was to take out the centre spring and the 4 counterbalance springs. This made it easier to fly a helicopter, but the sticking was still there. Without the spring, it made flying jets difficult, which expect to return to centre action. In this video, I will share with you how I fixed this problem. The video follows these steps. I would set aside about 4 hours to complete the project. For example, it took an hour just to apply the grease and reassemble the stick. Most of the time will be spent sanding and testing the components. I've taken the stick partially apart before and used silicone grease to see if it would make a difference, the type used for swimming pool valves, which was rubber and plastic safe. It was a total waste of time. It didn't make any difference at all. If you want to fix this issue for good, you'll need to disassemble the joystick, fix the ridges and apply the right type of grease. Now there are 2 types of grease you can use and both will get the job done. They each have their own advantages and disadvantages. In my opinion, the best grease to solve the Warthog sticking issue is the Nyogel 767A damping grease. It cost me $52 for a 50-gram tube on eBay posted from the USA to Australia and 4 weeks delivery time. It's made by Nye Lubricants. It's a very heavy viscosity synthetic hydrocarbon grease for mechanical and electromechanical components that require heavy damping. It is very difficult to remove from clothing or any surface for that matter. It has no odour and it's clear. You'll need about 1/3 of a 50-gram tube. The stickiness of the Nyogel is a good counterbalance for the strong Thrustmaster spring. You can also use Lumar gear grease. It's not as sticky, but it's also plastic safe. Start by disassembling the joystick. And don't worry about forgetting which way everything goes. Each step has a photo in this video, so you can see which way around things should go when you start to reassemble it. Put the screws and parts in zip-locked plastic bags. Keep the paper towel handy and replace it often as you remove the existing grease. Clean the parts as you go. I found that while the alcohol was useful, it didn't dissolve the grease or glue, but it did help when used with the paper towel. Unscrew the control board and the Hall effect sensor housing. Use a separate plastic bag for the screws and components. Unplug the 2 ribbon cables. I removed the gasket which was stuck to the inside of the upper assembly and removed the glue. Pop out the lower gimbal pins using a screwdriver and clean everything with paper towel and alcohol. Don't leave any of the original lubricant behind. At this point, check that the 4 metal posts are tightly screwed in. There are black screws underneath the metal plate if you need to nip them up, otherwise if they are loose, the post will spin when you put the screw in from the top. Now inspect the parts. You can clearly see the moulding ridges which need to be taken down. I started with 120 grit sandpaper. I know this sounds extreme. It would have taken way too long to get the moulding seam smooth, and the extra time using the higher grade sandpaper would put too much strain on the wires. And as it was, I had to repair one of the wires anyway. Get to work sanding. You can see in these shots the marks left by the 120 grit paper. It's very rough, but I followed it with 400, 600 and 800 grit. Make a sanding paper roll and lightly sand inside the pin housing. There's a ridge of plastic on the pin housing on the inside of the lower gimbal housing. Not too much, just enough to take off any ridges. You'll need a tight fit for the lower gimbal pins. The inner gimbal pins need a little sanding as well. Don't sand the top shoulder because we don't want that loose and falling out. It's only held into the housing by friction. It does have a small locating notch which needs to be pointing up when you do press the pins in. Do a test fit with the gimbal. It needs to move freely. The most important area to ensure is smooth is where the pin cover meets the outer part of the upper gimbal housing. It mustn't have any ridge. I spent most of my time getting this area smooth. Clean everything with paper towel and alcohol. Make sure all the plastic dust is removed, even from your work area. The lower gimbal housing has a locating pin, so it only goes in one way on the metal plate. At this point, I reassembled the joystick and tried it out without the grease. It was still sticking at these points. Back to the sandpaper. I did this several times until there was no sticking points. I used long barbecue matches because I didn't want the fibres from cotton buds to be pulled off by the grease. This is especially important for Nyogel, not so much for Lumar. You can use a small bladed screwdriver to apply the grease as well. The Nyogel tube will need to have part of the nozzle cut off with a sharp knife, otherwise it will be very difficult to get the grease out. For Lumar, you can use your finger to apply the grease, but don't use your finger for Nyogel. It's very difficult to remove and it resists soap and rubbing alcohol. Start the reassembly phase by putting the grease on the inside of the lower gimbal. Then grease the pins and insert slightly. Now put the grease on the gimbal itself. Use the matchstick to line it up with pins, and then finally press the pins in as hard as you can with your fingers. Make sure the cutout is on the left hand side of the joystick. Note this will appear to you on the right if you have the cable facing you. Both the ribbon cable and the earth wire need to be nestled into the cutout, otherwise they'll be guillotined by the magnet when you press the top gimbal onto the bottom one. At this point, and before completing assembly, attach the joystick handle and test it in Windows joystick panel. With confidence that the joystick is working, remove the handle and fit the base. Grease the spring posts and the outside of the upper gimbal. Apply grease to the inside of the top assembly. Slide on the 4 springs and top assembly and grease inside the outer collar. This will reduce any friction from the spring rubbing on it. Grease the spring all over. Start at the bottom of the spring while holding it with your other hand. Once you get halfway and it becomes difficult to hold, rest it on the collar and finish it off. Now fit the main spring plate. At this point, the strong spring is pressing upward on the plate. Keep the spring completely compressed with one hand until any 2 opposite screws are completely screwed in. Don't tighten the screws too much. Fit the top screw cover plate and you're done. This is the smooth action now. On my motion platform, I removed the yoke and the general aviation throttle and attached the HOTAS and recalibrated using the Windows joystick control panel. Well, I hope that was useful. Bye for now.